I'm Ron Baker, Director of the Canadian Small Church Ministry Centre, sponsored by Small Church Connections here in Canada. And this is us, Canadian Small Churches in Action podcast. Today, we have a special guest coming all the way from a little town called Toronto, Ontario. And I'm just going to let her introduce herself and tell a little bit about her ministry journey and what she's currently doing. And then we'll pop into some questions related particularly to Canada in the current. We'll just call it that. So I'll let you take it away, Dorothy, and we'll go from there.
Thanks so much for inviting me, Ron. So, hello, everyone. My name is Dorothy Pang. I'm the director of the Tyndale Intercultural Ministry Center, the TIM Center for short. But my story starts in Saskatchewan. Ron and I were just connecting about our mutual connection to Regina,
Yeah,
Saskatchewan. And actually, we both graduated from the same high school, so we are immediately friends. Um,
definitely.
Yes. So after I graduated from high school, I got my business degree, and then I went and got a law degree. And God brought me out to Toronto to practice law. And not just any type of law. I ended up doing class action litigation in Toronto. So, have you seen the movie Aaron Brockovich?
Mm-hmm.
We were the counsel for the plaintiffs. So we were
Ah,
the impoverished plaintiff counsel who wore the white hat, trying to do justice for the little guy in these David and Goliath type lawsuits. But in Toronto, my client pool was very diverse because Toronto itself is very diverse.
mm-hmm.
And so, in that practice of law, I had quite a lot of interactions with people from different backgrounds, education backgrounds, socioeconomic background, and of course, ethnic backgrounds. I thought I was a legal translator, but actually, I turned out to be a cultural translator to my
Oh,
clients.
yeah.
So I did that for about 20 years, and then God called me into ministry, and I co-led a church that was intentionally intercultural. And so I have lots of stories about how we managed or perhaps mismanaged staff interactions because we missed cultural dynamics. But God doesn't waste anything. He used all my stories from my law and now my stories from leading the church because during COVID, God called me into intercultural ministries. So that's where I am right now. The TIM Center focuses on developing leaders who are leading in intercultural spaces, and we help leaders engage more effectively. So if you are a leader in Canada, you are leading in intercultural spaces because God is
Mhm.
bringing the nations to Canada.
Yeah, there's no question about that. So I think, well, let me just ask a very straightforward question. Small churches in Canada, why do they have to think outside of just being monocultural?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So many things to say about that. But
Okay,
first, I would
go for
say
it.
I would quote from Wayne Gretzky. He says that he's infamous for saying, "I don't skate to where the puck is. I skate to
Mhm.
where the puck is
It's going
going."
exactly.
Now, Canada. Where is the puck going in Canada? God is bringing the nations to our country.
Mhm.
So we have 450 different ethnic groups. We have over 200 languages. What does it look like to be a church leader in small churches when so many new Canadians are now part of the communities that you are serving in? So I use the word intercultural very intentionally.
Right.
I know we've probably all heard multicultural. We may have even used cross-cultural, but I use the word intercultural. So some of your listeners might be wondering, well, is there a distinction? And is there a distinction that matters? I would say yes. So Canada is a multicultural country. If you think of a box of crayons, when I was a little girl,
Mhm.
every start of school, I wanted that Crayola box of crayons. You know the one I'm talking about,
Oh, I do.
yes, the multicolored box of crayons. And you open the lid, and there it is. All the different colored crayons, all standing shoulder to shoulder. And when it comes time to making a picture, all the crayons express themselves in their colors, but they are still acting like crayons. Everybody acts the same way.
Mhm.
So multicultural to me is a collection of differences, but we're all acting the same way and we're not really mixing.
So there's
In
there's a there's a predominant culture in one sense, a predominant approach
Yes,
maybe would be a better way.
yeah, we're all acting like crayons, right? So, but intercultural is a bucket of art supplies, and you pour it onto the table, and there's chalk, and there's pencil crayons, and there's water paints, and there's wax paints. And when you start drawing a picture using all those different art mediums, sometimes the wax doesn't mix well with the water paint, and sometimes the water paint doesn't mix well with the chalk, but it's in those interactions that something beautiful is co-created and there is a new expression that both art mediums contributed equally to, and that new expression is co-created together. So that is intercultural. So what does it look like in our churches when people come from all their different cultural expressions and they get to co-create that space together? They can both contribute to that space together, and they don't all have to act like crayons.
Very true. But it seems like, and I'll be a little controversial here. It seems like at some point there is a group or a way in which we're expected to work. And so some have to submit to a different approach. Let's talk a little bit. How do you deal with those conflicts?
Okay, so I am so glad you raised that, Ron, because
Okay.
I'm not afraid to poke the bear either.
Okay.
So what you're talking about is power, right? You're talking
Yes,
about the
exactly.
power dynamics. So in our world, we hear a lot about three big words: diversity, inclusion, and belonging. So diversity is what I was talking about, a collection of crayons. Everybody brings their different colors, and you all show up to the same party. But that's just a collection of differences. Inclusion is when the person who owns that space says, hey, let's do something together. You can come to my table, right? But embedded in that invitation of inclusion is power, because
Mhm.
whoever is doing the including owns the table, and whoever is being included is always the guest. And so in our churches, if we always want to play the role of host and they are always the guest, we will never get to belonging. But it's just so much more comfortable to be the host, isn't it? Because
Oh,
if we're
yes.
yeah, because if we're the host, we get to make the rules.
Mhm.
We get to say, this is my space, this is our space, and you are invited. But that implies that sometimes that you are always the guest. So some of the phrases I hear at churches are make yourself at home. And I know people mean that well intentioned, but when a guest comes and makes themselves at home, how comfortable are you when they start actually moving the furniture, right?
Mhm.
It's your furniture. But are you comfortable if they actually make themselves at home and they start moving the furniture? Or they start putting their food in your fridge and your fridge starts to smell different, right? So how comfortable are you about that, right? So it's about power dynamics and it's about who owns that space. So yes, I think it is uncomfortable. And I think that our church leaders need to normalize discomfort. We need to normalize disruption. And why? Because ultimately, in this new family that Jesus ordained, we all belong together. And that has to be the driving conviction for why we welcome new people to our spaces and we belong together.
Small churches have constantly been known for relationships and ability to work together with each other. Does that really work?
So I lit up as soon as you said that
Yes.
because yes, so small churches, your biggest strength is relationships.
Mhm.
So when new Canadians come to our church and they're looking for a place of belonging, small churches can this is your moment. This is your strength. This is the strength that God has given your church. You can build relationships together, right? And create these spaces of belonging. But just as Ron, you and I were just talking about,
Mhm.
be aware of the power dynamic, because if you are always perpetually the host and they are always perpetually the guest, you cannot get to the space of belonging.
How do you end up not being the host?
Great question. So, this is what the TIM Center does. We
Mhm.
help leaders develop intercultural competency. So, intercultural competency is the how between diversity and inclusion.
Yeah.
It's that center gear to get us from diversity to inclusion and belonging. So, intercultural competency is a skill that you can develop, and it's the ability to read the cultural cues in the room. Every room you step into, there are unspoken rules, right? So, Ron, you and I, we have an unspoken rule. You told me that we were going to start this podcast at 11, and I showed up exactly at 11, because for you and I, time, we have a certain understanding of time, right? But we
Yes.
learn that from our culture. We learn that time is limited, time must be budgeted, and if we treat time well, we are showing respect to each other. But in other cultures, time is fluid, right?
Oh,
Time
very much
never,
so.
yeah, very much so. Time never runs out. And we will get to the second event after the first event has naturally finished its course. So we never run out of time. Time is based on the event itself. So, but you and I had this unspoken rule, this unspoken understanding that when Ron said 11 o'clock, I
Mhm.
showed up at 11 o'clock. And that's an act of respect. But that's a cultural cue. So intercultural competency teaches you how to read those cultural cues.
Now you have how will I put this? You've got a way to walk through that. I wouldn't call it a survey, maybe a survey, maybe a what type of things do you ask? What type of things do you sort of push those of
Yeah.
us that would love to keep our own culture sacred?
Yes. So, how do we develop intercultural competency? So, at the TIM Center, we use a tool called the IDI. It stands for the Intercultural Development Inventory tool. It's an online assessment. So, as an analogy, if you wanted to lose weight, the first thing you would do is get on a scale. There is no good or bad weight. You just need to know what your baseline is,
Yeah,
right?
that's a good
And
stand. Yeah.
yeah, and once you know what your weight is, then you develop a plan to help you reach your goal. So the IDI is the same thing. We assess how you are currently making sense of difference. When we encounter someone who is different from us, our bodies actually tell us. Sometimes
Yeah.
our heart beats faster. Sometimes we sweat a little bit more. We just feel that anxiety is like, oh, Ron and I are not connecting. Somehow we're misunderstanding each other, right? Our bodies will tell us. So the IDI measures, how do you resolve that tension? So once we finish that online assessment, the results come to the TIM Center, and we will book a one-on-one debrief with you over Zoom, and we will go over the results with you. We will pull out your story about how you are seeing culture show up in your ministry context and what we're seeing in the results. And that will help you understand your results. And then from there, we give you an individualized development plan, a basket of activities that you can do to help you grow in intercultural competency. So that's the main tool we use.
Okay.
Now, as a team or as a church, we also do full day or half day trainings. And those are the things that I love the most, because I get to come in, I get to work with your team, and we develop, or I will teach you some very tangible skills to help you read the unspoken rules in the room.
So I come as a small church and I say, I'm watching the change in Canada, which you would be able to explain more fully that this has become very much a multicultural. I remember Pierre Elliott Trudeau talking about that, and that was back when I was a kid. Unfortunately, I can go back that far. And we were talking about how it's going to become multicultural. And even that 50, 60 years ago, there was a lot of resistance to accepting other people.
Yeah.
How do we get past that kind of resistance that I think is still prominent and prevalent even amongst, and I'll be a little more controversial, those that immigrated in the 60s and 70s from other places? They are different than a second generation. And how do we deal with that whole question in churches, where we're not only dealing with an original group, now we're dealing with a second generation? Okay, that has all sorts of questions in it. Why don't you just run with it?
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot in that question,
Yeah,
Ron.
yes, there is.
I would say to all our church leaders out there, you need to start with your why. And the why is with God, right? Our God, so from cover to cover in our Bibles, from Genesis to Revelations, we see that our God is a God of diversity. He could have created one plant, he
Mhm.
could have created one animal, but instead he chose, as an expression of our creative God, he chose to create many different plants and many different animals, and male and female. That's how God envisioned this humanity, this planet, to be, as an expression of who he is, which is a creative God.
Mhm.
And then we see at the end of time, Revelations, that all tribes, tongues, and nations will be gathered before the throne of God, worshiping together. And our differences, our cultural differences are not absent. They're actually brought before the throne of God to worship together. So our churches need to be signposts of that future church to come. Our churches need to be foretastes of that family ordained by Jesus, all together, everyone belonging. So that's the driving why. So that would be my first piece of advice to church leaders. Get to know your theology of diversity.
Mhm.
Get fully grounded on the biblical foundation for why we need more of each other in order to understand more of God. I think about Ephesians, where Paul talks about how God is building his holy temple brick by brick, and we are those bricks. But if some people are missing, we are actually missing out on understanding the full image of God. Ephesians, Paul also talks about the body of God, the body of Christ, right? We need each other. That we cannot say to each other that we don't need each other. So get firmly grounded on your why, because Ron, as you and I have been talking, differences and
Mhm.
intercultural interaction is messy, and
Very messy.
and it's uncomfortable, right? And it's just so much easier if we could all just act like crayons, right?
Yeah,
Right? Wouldn't it
it
be,
would.
right? Everyone just behave the same and we will
Mhm.
all get along, right?
It,
I
it, yeah, it doesn't really work. And even within the crayons, there's what we used to call the black sheep. So you had them colored in one corner, and then you had all the rest of them, and we always are constantly working with uniqueness, I guess would be a way to put it, and yet trying to work together.
Yeah. I would I would also say that we need to change our mindset
Mhm.
that differences are bad, or that
Right.
differences are trouble, or is a threat to unity, or that differences is a hurdle that we need to go across over. I actually really think we need to change our mindset that differences is a reflection of our creative God. He purposely gave us different ethnicities and differences. This is who He is. This is who His new family is supposed to be. So we need to normalize differences, or even embrace differences as the richness, the richness that we need to cull in order to better understand this creative God that we've all been formed in, or formed after. So,
So now let's jump back to the small church. Where, leadership wise, who needs to be leaders What should be their attitude, and who should be included in the whole leadership role in a church?
Okay, so
Yeah.
I'm not going to be afraid to poke the bear there either.
Okay.
So all across Canada, we are now seeing pastoral shortages, and that includes the small churches in Canada. So there will be succession conversations all across Canada, and our our Canadian Christian landscape. Um, how do I say this? We have lots of new Canadian pastors coming into the country.
Yes.
Can we envision that one day the pastor of your small church would be someone from a different country, not raised in Canada, looking different than than the retiring pastor? Are we okay with a fall coming under the leadership of someone who has been shaped and born from another country? So that's the challenge that is coming to all our churches in Canada, and that requires humility, mutual learning, mutual submission.
I speak from a background where I served as an interim pastor at a church, very much one culture, and they started looking for a new pastor. And just as you said, where do we find pastors across Canada? There's a shortage. It ends up that the new pastor that they have is not from Canada and
Mhm.
definitely does not look like those that would have been part of the church. They have embraced that, thankfully. And yes, and I'm very happy for that. But it does take an attitude and emotion towards including people and saying we're all part of the family.
Yeah, exactly. Which is why I say the first step is get grounded on your biblical theology. So of diversity. And if you prepare your people well and you prepare yourself well, then that kind of transition will be something that you actually embrace for the
Mhm.
richness that comes from having a pastor who is different from you, right? You actually get to see more of God, right? So rather than feel that, oh, this doesn't feel like my church anymore. It doesn't feel like things have changed and we're not doing things the way we used to, right? So.
Which is a huge thing, is that whole we're not doing things the way we used to.
Mhm.
And now myself, just having moved from a rural area into a very urban area, I'm seeing that the change that has to happen where we embrace other cultures is not easy. As you've talked about, it's a conflictive thing. And
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, and I think one of the learning or one of the growth edges for all of us, including myself, is understanding our own cultural identity, right?
Okay.
Sometimes, yeah, so sometimes when I start my teaching sessions, I'll introduce myself as a Chinese Canadian.
Mhm.
But that hyphen in the middle is very complicated for me. Because on the one hand, I really embrace the Chinese and the Canadian heritage that God has specifically given me and designed me with. On the other hand, until all Canadians introduce themselves as some sort of hyphenated Canadian, when I introduce myself as a hyphenated Canadian, it feels like I am less than. Like, you know, those math numbers,
Mhm.
there's the whole number, and then there are the fractional numbers, one
Yep.
third, two thirds. You're not quite the whole number, but you're close. So that's how I feel sometimes about the hyphen. So that's what I mean when I have a very complicated relationship with the hyphen. But even as I'm sharing that story now, I'm hoping that your listeners, and including yourself, Ron, you're thinking, if Dorothy asked me now to introduce myself as a hyphenated Canadian, what would I say?
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? And how has my cultural identity shaped my leadership, shaped the way I engage with others, right? We just don't think enough about the cultural gifts that God has given us for the mission that he has asked us to partner with him in. So that is actually one of the first steps when it comes to developing intercultural competency that I work with my students. It's like, let's talk about your cultural identity. So I will leave that with your listeners, right? If Dorothy were to ask you to introduce yourself as a hyphenated Canadian,
Mhm.
what would it be, and how has that cultural identity shaped your leadership?
Okay, cultural identity comes along with the question of, and we actually started off talking about power.
Mhm.
How do we move towards humility?
Good question. Okay. So our example is always Jesus, right? We want to be Jesus-shaped leaders. So how did Jesus enter this world? He entered this world as a guest, right? He gave up his power and his position to be incarnated as an infant. So he was a guest in Mary's womb. He was a guest on our planet.
Mhm.
And as you read the way that he lived his life, he was a guest at people's homes. He was a guest in at people's tables. I think of the story of his encounter with the Samaritan woman. He was a guest at the well, right? He asked for water, right? He was the
Mhm.
recipient. He was not the host, right? He asked questions about her life instead of telling her about himself. So that is our example of humility. And that's why, yeah, the whole question about power, the whole question about who is the host and who is the guest is integral to this conversation
Yeah.
about intercultural competency. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to do a cultural thing here and just say we're done now. Yeah, but I've enjoyed this so much, and as I say, I have many more questions I'd love to ask, but there is one question that I like to use and finish off my podcast with, and this one is just very broad. You can pick and choose however you want to go at it, but if you had one piece of advice for a small church pastor or a leader, what would that piece of advice be? You can just pick and choose anything that you want.
Yeah. My advice would be to persevere. I know intercultural competency is complicated and it is difficult, but this is the Canadian church's moment. God is bringing the nations to our country, and we as a country get to showcase what it's like to be unified in diversity, right? Unity
Mhm.
in diversity. And that only the Christian church can showcase that. The media will tell us that the Olympics is the greatest display of humanity's unity. That is not true,
Mhm.
right? Neither is the United Nations. You know what the greatest display of human unity is? It's the Christian church. So small church pastors persevere, normalize disruption, get grounded in your theology, and just keep going.
That is amazing and marvelous idea. Thank you very, very much. As I say, I'm sorry we're going to have to cut it off, but thank you, Dorothy.
Thank you so much for inviting me.